Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. I had always trusted him, my husband. He was my rock, the person I could rely on. But recently, something felt off. It started with the late nights. He'd leave after dinner, telling me he was working late or had a meeting. I didn't question it at first. After all, he was always busy, and I understood the pressures of his job. But then, the excuses began to pile up. He was gone longer and longer. Some nights, he'd return after midnight, acting strange, distant. He'd give me a peck on the cheek, then retreat to the bedroom without even a glance in my direction. I tried not to think too much about it, but something in my gut told me that this wasn't just about work. It was more than that, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I wasn't being told. My curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what he was really doing. One evening, I decided I'd had enough. I would find out the truth. He told me he was meeting a client for drinks after work, and I was supposed to meet a friend for dinner. It was the perfect opportunity. I decided not to go to dinner and instead followed him. My heart raced as I slipped into the shadows, careful not to be seen. I followed him as he drove out of our neighborhood, taking a route I hadn't expected. I tried to keep a safe distance, but every time he turned a corner, my pulse quickened. The deeper into the city we went, the more confused I became. He wasn't heading to the usual office buildings. He seemed to be going somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere private. After about 20 minutes, he pulled up to a dark alley and parked. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't a corporate building. He was about to enter a nightclub, of all places. I was paralyzed with confusion. Why had he gone to a nightclub? I couldn't fathom it. There was no mention of a social event or a gathering. This was something entirely different. I was on edge, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I waited for a few minutes, letting him get ahead, before quietly following him inside. The club was dimly lit, with flashing lights and loud music that seemed to pulse with the beat of my racing heart. I felt out of place in my casual clothes, surrounded by people who were dressed to the nines. I hid near the entrance, trying to spot him in the crowd. My mind was spinning. What was he doing here? Who was he meeting? The longer I stood there, the more I realized I didn't know my husband as well as I thought. And the deeper this night would take me, the less I would recognize him. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw him. There he was, walking confidently across the room, laughing with someone. But what caught me completely off guard was his appearance. My husband, the man I thought I knew, was dressed in full drag. He wore a bright red wig, bold makeup, and a skin-tight dress that shimmered under the lights. His heels clacked loudly on the floor as he moved with an elegance I didn't know he had. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. Was this a joke? Was this some kind of elaborate performance or costume party? He was nothing like the man I had married. Who was this person? Why was he hiding this from me? My thoughts were racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. This was my husband, yet he seemed so different, unrecognizable. What was he doing here, and why hadn't he ever told me? I watched him as he took the stage, strutting with a confidence that made my heart sink. He wasn't the shy, reserved man I knew. No, this person was someone completely different, someone who seemed at home in this world. As he grabbed the microphone, the crowd cheered and clapped. He was introduced under a name I didn't recognize, a name that sounded bold and outrageous. I felt a lump form in my throat. He was living a double life, and I had no idea. The person I had loved for years had been hiding this secret from me, and I couldn't understand why. Why hadn't he told me? Did he think I wouldn't accept it? I felt my stomach churn as he began his performance, singing and dancing with an energy I had never seen in him before. It was as if he was a completely different person, someone I couldn't even recognize. This wasn't the man I married. The crowd was going wild, screaming his name, applauding every move he made. My husband, well, the man I thought was my husband, was thriving under the spotlight. He looked like he belonged here. His movements were graceful, seductive, and full of life. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I was torn between being fascinated and devastated. The emotions swirling inside me were overwhelming. Who was this woman on stage? I had to find out more, but I also felt like an intruder in this secret world I didn't know existed. The more I watched, the more questions piled up in my mind. What was he doing here? Was this some kind of secret passion? Had I missed all the signs? Why didn't he ever confide in me? I had no answers, only more questions. The performance ended, and the crowd erupted in applause. My husband, now someone else entirely, took a bow. But I had seen enough. This wasn't the life I thought we shared. As the lights dimmed, I saw him retreat backstage with a fellow performer. She was stunning, wearing a glamorous outfit and a look of admiration on her face. They exchanged a few words, laughing and chatting like old friends, or maybe something more. My heart pounded in my chest. This woman, this other performer, was the last thing I expected to see. Was she a friend? A fellow performer? Or was she something else? I couldn't tell, but there was something about the way they interacted that made my blood run cold. It was as if they shared a bond that I could never understand. I watched as they disappeared behind the curtain, and I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. What was going on between them? Were they just friends, or was there something more? I needed answers, but I couldn't stay here much longer. I had to leave before they realized I was watching, but I knew I couldn't just walk away. I had to know the truth. I stepped back into the shadows, my mind racing. The more I tried to make sense of what I'd seen, the more my thoughts tangled. My husband had been hiding a secret life, one I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams. How had I not noticed? Had I been so wrapped up in my own world that I missed all the signs? The woman backstage with him lingered in my mind. There was something about her presence, something more intimate than friendship. I couldn't believe I was even considering the possibility, but what else could it be? My heart felt heavy as I waited in the darkened club, too afraid to move, too afraid to confront him. I needed answers. I needed to know if this was just a phase or something deeper. Was he seeing this woman? Were they together? My emotions were a mix of anger, disbelief, and deep sadness. But one thing was clear. I could no longer pretend everything was fine. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. The performance, the woman, the way my husband seemed to transform before my eyes. Everything felt like a lie. I had to know the truth, but confronting him now seemed impossible. What would I say? How could I ask about something so personal, so hidden from me for so long? I spent the next few days in a daze, my mind replaying every moment of that night. I tried to act normal when he came home, but it was impossible to ignore the distance between us. He didn't notice my silence, though. He was too caught up in his own world. It felt as though we were strangers living in the same house, coexisting but never truly connecting. I wanted to ask him about the nightclub, about the woman, about everything, but I feared his reaction. What if he denied it all? What if he told me I was imagining things? My heart ached, unsure of how to face the truth. The following week, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in my chest. Every time I saw him, I felt a mix of love, betrayal, and confusion. I needed to know if this was an affair, or if it was something deeper. I couldn't let him keep living this double life without confronting him. But every time I thought about bringing it up, fear gripped me. What if he got defensive? What if he laughed it off, or accused me of being paranoid? I knew I had to approach this carefully, but I also knew that I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. That night, after dinner, I asked him where he'd been, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me. He shrugged it off as another late meeting, but I could tell he was getting nervous. My heart pounded as I waited for him to tell me the truth, but he remained evasive. I knew I was getting closer, but the weight of his secrets was starting to suffocate me. I couldn't let this go any longer. I had to find out more. The next night, I told him I was going out with some friends. In truth, I wasn't meeting anyone. I was following him again. I couldn't sit in the dark anymore, pretending everything was normal while he was out living a life I knew nothing about. I waited outside the house, watching him get in his car and drive off. My heart raced with anticipation and dread. He headed back to the same nightclub. I followed at a distance, my pulse pounding in my ears. This time, I couldn't just stand in the shadows. I needed to confront him, to demand the truth. I didn't know how I would do it, but I knew I couldn't wait any longer. As I approached the club, I saw him entering through the same back door. My legs felt heavy, but I pushed myself forward, determined to find answers. I wasn't going to be a bystander in my own life any longer. I entered the nightclub, my nerves on edge. The music was deafening, the flashing lights overwhelming, but I pushed through the chaos. I needed to find him. I moved through the crowd, scanning the room. The same drag performer was on stage, and this time, I saw him in the wings. He was watching her with a look of admiration, something more than just appreciation for her talent. I felt a pang of jealousy that I couldn't shake. It was clear they shared something more than just a stage performance. But what did it mean? Was this just a professional relationship, or was it something else entirely? As I watched them interact, I realized there was a connection between them, something intimate, something that went beyond the stage. My heart sank. It was like watching my husband live a completely different life, a life that didn't include me. I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed to confront him, to face the truth. I waited in the shadows, my breath shallow, as they finished their performance. My husband disappeared backstage, and I followed. I was so close now, close enough to hear their laughter, the way their voices blended together. When I peeked around the corner, I saw them standing close, their hands almost touching. The other performer leaned in, whispering something in his ear. The way they looked at each other, it wasn't just admiration. There was something deeper, something more than what I had imagined. They were more than just co-workers, more than just performers. I felt a sharp pang of jealousy and betrayal as I watched them interact. He hadn't just been hiding a secret life. He had been living a lie. I had been left in the dark, while he built this world without me. I felt a mix of anger and heartbreak. I wanted to storm in and demand answers, but I stayed hidden, paralyzed by the realization that everything I thought I knew was a lie. They continued talking, laughing, and I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped out from my hiding spot, my legs trembling as I walked toward them. My husband turned, and the look on his face, surprise, then guilt, was enough to stop me in my tracks. The other performer looked between us, clearly sensing the tension. My heart raced as I tried to find my voice. I opened my mouth, but no words came out at first. I felt like a stranger in my own life. Finally, I managed to speak, my voice shaking. "What's going on here?" I asked, barely able to control the emotions bubbling inside me. My husband looked at me, then at the other performer, his face paling. He didn't answer immediately, and the silence felt deafening. The performer stood silently, her eyes flicking between us. I felt like I was suffocating. I had waited so long for this moment, but now that it had arrived, I wasn't sure I was ready for the truth. The silence between us stretched on, unbearable and thick. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at my husband. The performer stood silently, watching us, like a third party to a conversation that wasn't hers to interrupt. I could feel my breath catching in my throat. Finally, my husband spoke, but his voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. "It's not what you think," he said, running a hand through his hair, looking anywhere but at me. I wasn't sure whether to believe him. "Not what I think," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "You've been hiding this whole other life from me, and now you tell me it's not what I think?" My words were sharp, but the pain in my chest was sharper. I had given him everything, trusted him completely, and here he was, telling me it wasn't what I thought. I wanted to shout, to scream, but instead, I just stood there, my emotions overwhelming me. The performer finally spoke up. "Maybe it's time you knew the truth," she said softly. The words hit me like a freight train. The truth. What did she mean by that? My husband's eyes flicked nervously between us, and I could tell he was struggling to find the right words. "I never meant to hurt you," he began, but I could already hear the lies in his tone. "I've been," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The performer stepped forward, her eyes softening with understanding. "He's been living two lives," she said gently, her gaze never leaving mine. "This is who he is, who he wants to be." I felt my legs buckle slightly as I processed her words. I had thought I knew him, but I realized now that I had never known him at all. "Two lives?" I asked, barely able to speak. "You've been living as someone else, as her?" I couldn't even finish the question. My mind was spinning. He had been living a lie, hiding behind a facade, and I had been the fool who never suspected. My husband looked at me, his face full of guilt. "I didn't want to hurt you," he repeated, but the words felt empty. I was ashamed, afraid of what you would think. I could barely comprehend his words. Ashamed? I asked incredulously. You've been lying to me for months, hiding a whole other world, and you think I wouldn't care? You think I wouldn't have understood? The anger in my voice surprised me. For so long, I had been numb to the situation, unsure of what to feel. But now, the betrayal was clear, and it burned. The performer spoke again, this time with a softness in her tone. He's been exploring a side of himself that he couldn't share with you, she said. It's not just about the drag. It's about who he is. I felt like the ground was slipping beneath me. My husband wasn't just performing on stage. He was living a completely different identity. This was no longer a simple affair. It was a whole new life he had been keeping from me. The weight of her words sank in, and I felt my body go numb. Who he is? I repeated, my voice trembling. What does that even mean? Who is he really? My head spun as I tried to make sense of everything. The man I had married was someone entirely different. I had thought we had built a life together, but he had been hiding pieces of himself from me, pieces I could never have imagined. This is who I am, my husband finally said, his voice shaking. This is part of me. I've always loved performing. I love the freedom it gives me, but that wasn't the only thing. I could tell there was more he wasn't saying. The performer glanced at me, her eyes filled with sympathy, and for a moment, I thought I saw something else, something more intimate between them. I turned away, unable to face them anymore. So what now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What do we do now? The silence stretched between us, and I wasn't sure if there was even a chance for us anymore. What was I supposed to do with all this? How could I go back to being the same person after this? I never wanted you to feel like you were second to anything, my husband said, his voice softer now. I love you, but this part of me, it's a part one can't hide anymore. My chest tightened at his words. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much he had hurt me. But at the same time, I felt something deeper, a kind of sadness that I couldn't put into words. This wasn't just about him. It was about me too. The truth had torn us apart, and I wasn't sure how we could come back from it. You should have told me, I said, my voice trembling. We could have talked about this. You didn't have to hide it. He reached out to me, but I stepped back. I couldn't let him touch me. Not yet. I needed space. I needed time to think. The other performer looked at me with understanding. You have every right to be angry, she said quietly, but maybe this could be a new beginning. For all of us. I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear that. I wasn't sure if I was ready for anything anymore. In the days that followed, I struggled to make sense of everything. My husband's double life had shattered everything I thought I knew. The truth had come out, and now there was no going back. I couldn't stop replaying our conversations in my head. The way he had explained himself, the way he had talked about his love for performing. But even as I tried to understand his feelings, there was a lingering question that gnawed at me. What about us? Was our marriage just a lie? I spent nights alone, tossing and turning, wondering if I could ever truly forgive him. Could I accept this side of him, or was the damage done? The pain of his betrayal was still fresh, and I couldn't seem to escape it. The performer had told me it was a new beginning, but all I could see was the end of everything I had believed in. Was it possible to rebuild trust, or had he broken it beyond repair? I didn't have the answers, and I wasn't sure if I ever would. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself caught in an emotional whirlwind. My mind shifted between anger and confusion, and I couldn't escape the overwhelming feeling of betrayal. I tried to act normal in front of friends and family, but inside, I was falling apart. My husband seemed remorseful, but his actions spoke differently. Every time he tried to comfort me, I couldn't help but feel like it was too little, too late. How could I trust him again? How could I look at him the same way when I knew he had been living this secret life all along? Every moment felt strained. Every conversation felt like an interrogation. I couldn't move past the image of him in drag, performing under a different name. It was like a scar that wouldn't heal, a constant reminder that everything we had was built on lies. But still, I held on to a thread of hope. Maybe we could rebuild. Maybe there was a way forward. I wasn't ready to give up, but I wasn't sure how much more I could take. One evening, as I sat in silence, my husband came to me with a heavy look in his eyes. "I know I've hurt you," he said quietly, sitting beside me, "but I want to make things right. I need you to understand. This isn't something I can just give up." His words hit me hard, and my chest tightened. "I don't know if I can understand," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "You've been hiding this from me for so long. How am I supposed to just accept it?" He reached for my hand, but I pulled away, not wanting to be touched. "I love you," he said, his voice strained. "But I also need this. It's part of who I am." I could see the truth in his eyes, but that didn't make it any easier. How could I come to terms with the fact that my husband needed something I could never give him? My emotions swirled. Love, frustration, and hurt all tangled together. I found myself questioning everything. Was I being selfish for not understanding his need to perform? Was I too blinded by my own expectations to accept him for who he was? But then, the reality of the situation set in. He wasn't just performing for the fun of it. He was living a double life, hiding his true self behind a mask. And worse, he had been seeing another performer. The jealousy that had simmered beneath the surface bubbled up again. I couldn't shake the image of them together, sharing something I could never be part of. It felt like a betrayal on top of a betrayal. But what did that mean for me? Was I supposed to just sit back and watch as he built this new identity, this new world without me? I wanted to fight for us, but I wasn't sure where to start. I wasn't sure I could ever look at him the same way again. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to confront the truth. We were no longer the couple we had been. We had changed, and the love we once shared now felt like a distant memory. I wasn't sure who he was anymore, or who I was in this new reality. The walls between us had grown too high to climb. Even when we tried to talk, there was an unspoken barrier between us. The intimacy we had once shared felt like it was slipping through my fingers, but I still cared about him, and the idea of walking away completely terrified me. Could we ever find a way back to each other? Could we rebuild the trust that had been shattered? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. I needed to make a decision. I needed to figure out what was best for me. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about my own happiness and my future. I spent a lot of time alone, reflecting on everything that had happened. I asked myself hard questions about our marriage, about my feelings, about what I was willing to accept. I knew I couldn't continue living in limbo, pretending things were okay when they were far from it. I had tried to understand him, to be patient, but at what cost? My own self-respect was on the line. The more I thought about the affair, the more I realized it wasn't just about the other drag performer. It was about the fact that my husband had been hiding this entire world from me. I had trusted him, and he had betrayed that trust. Could I ever forgive him? Could I learn to live with his secrets, his lies, and the constant uncertainty of who he was? I didn't know the answers, but I knew one thing. I couldn't keep pretending. I needed to take control of my life again. I decided it was time to have one last conversation. There could be no more secrets, no more half-truths. I needed him to be honest with me, truly honest, about everything. So I asked him to meet me at a park, away from the house, away from distractions. He agreed, but I could tell he was nervous. When we sat down, I looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time in a long while, I needed to see beyond the facade, beyond the man he had become. "I need to know what you really want," I said, my voice steady. "Do you want to stay with me? Or do you want to keep living this other life? You have to decide. I can't keep living in this in-between." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me with a mixture of guilt and longing. I waited, holding my breath, knowing this could be the moment that would change everything. What would he choose? Would he choose me? Or would he choose the life he had built without me? The silence between us felt like an eternity. My husband finally took a deep breath. "I don't know," he admitted. "I love you, but I can't just stop being who I am. This part of me, it's not something I can turn off." His words stung, but I understood them. The pain of hearing him say it out loud, of hearing him admit he couldn't choose me, was overwhelming. "So what does that mean?" I asked quietly, my heart sinking. "Does that mean you want us to end?" He looked away, guilt clouding his expression. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't want to lose you, but I can't pretend to be someone I'm not." My chest tightened as I processed his words. This was it, the moment of truth. He couldn't give up who he was, and I couldn't keep living in this world of uncertainty. I had to make a choice. I had to decide if I was willing to accept him for who he was, or if it was time to let go. The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. I had never imagined it would come to this. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts of the life we had built, of the dreams I had once had for our future. I had always imagined growing old together, sharing everything. But now, it felt like we were worlds apart. I looked at him, my heart aching, and I asked the question I had been afraid to ask. Is this it? Is this where we end? His eyes filled with tears, and he shook his head. "I don't want to lose you," he said softly, "but I don't know how to live without both parts of me." My chest tightened as I realized that no matter how much he loved me, he couldn't stop being someone else. It was clear now. There was no way to go back to the way things had been. I spent the night alone, my mind in turmoil. I knew I couldn't live in this kind of emotional chaos forever. The decision had to be made. I loved him, but could I continue to live with the knowledge of his hidden life? Could I accept him as he was, even if it meant accepting everything that came with it? Or was it time to walk away, to find a way to heal from the betrayal and move on? The answer didn't come to me easily. I cried, I thought, and I cried some more. The love I had for him was still there, but the pain was too deep. In the end, I knew that my peace of mind had to come first. I couldn't keep living with the uncertainty of who he truly was. I called him the next morning, and when he answered, I knew the decision had already been made. "I think it's time," I said, my voice breaking. "I need to let go." The final conversation was painful, but necessary. We both knew it was the end, and as much as it hurt, there was a strange sense of relief in it. I had spent so long holding on to something that was slipping through my fingers. Now, I had to learn to let go. My husband didn't fight me. He understood. He had tried to have it both ways, but in the end, the truth had shattered everything. He promised to get help, to figure out who he was without all the layers of lies and deceit. But I knew, deep down, that our marriage had ended. I couldn't live in the shadows of his secrets anymore. I packed my things, said goodbye, and walked out the door. The weight on my shoulders lifted slightly with every step. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the most freeing. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never lose myself again.